Hello my dear friends, you're in the MilitarySummary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 27th of May of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv, more precisely about western Kharkiv direction. We have a fire anomaly along the borderlines which confirms that there are very heavy clashes exactly on this area. And it's not like a surprise to us, because if we increase the numbers of days since the beginning of months, we see a significant number of concentration exactly on this direction. The Ukrainians during the previous months were bombing and hunting the Russian forces with FPV drones in the villages like Dobropolye and Novoselovka, Novostroyevka II. The Russians from their side were hunting and attacking the Ukrainian FPV drone bases, and probably the clashes exactly in this area led in the future to the fire anomalies and, let's say, intensifying of actions from both sides. Maybe the Russians are planning to use this area for further offensive operation in direction of the village, the stronghold by the name of Zolochiv, let's say along this line. Who knows? But when talking about the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation today, they stated that there was a very heavy clashes in the vicinity of the villages by the name of Granev and Shevchenka, which confirms that most likely the Russians are planning to attack Zolochiv through Kazachий Lop in this way. Maybe the Russians are planning to use these two ways. For now, there is no, let's say attempts to, implement this operation on the ground. Just artillery strikes, huntings for Ukrainian artillery systems with Lancet, without once again any changes on the ground. So let's wait a little bit more. Probably soon we're going to receive more updates about this direction. Now let's move to the eastern, Kharkiv flank to the town by the name of Liptsy. If you remember, most of the mappers were showing this tree line at the control of Russian Federation, but today the Russian sources published the video of how they were fabbing this area with guided bombs, very heavy explosions, significant damage, and according to the author of this video, the Ukrainian armed force positions were bombed by the Russian forces, which, this video we were using to adjust the map, and now this territory we are showing as the territory under complete Ukrainian control. The only thing we don't know for sure whether the Ukrainians managed to restore control over this tree line as a result of Ukraine counterattack, or maybe the Russians didn't capture this tree line at the beginning of the offensive operation. So for now we are keeping this area as is. When talking about other updates from the direction, almost nothing happened, just the Russian huntings with Lancet. Another artillery system Bogdanov armed forces of Ukraine was discovered during the redeployment process from the Kharkiv to the north and destroyed as a result of Lancet strike. As you can see, the Ukrainians are using the forest between Kharkiv and Liptsy as the main rotation and defense belt and the main area of concentration of forces. Another Ukrainian artillery system was destroyed in the vicinity of Kharkiv. Not artillery system, but very expensive and very unique radar was discovered by the Russians and then later destroyed as a result of Lancet. So nothing special, no more updates, no more progress on the ground, just counter-artillery duels. Now we are moving further to Vovchansk direction. As we discussed in the previous update, we got just one important, update on the map. The Russians captured another block. This block was captured by the Russians according to the latest geolocations we received from the direction, which on the first hand confirms that the Russians still haven't managed to establish complete control over the northern part. On the other hand, it confirms that the Russians are moving regarding the losses and regarding the Ukrainian reinforcements and reserves. Furthermore, the Russians published the video that they managed to destroy the bridge that located in the northern part, the second bridge in the same area that used to connect the southern and the northern part of Vovchansk. The Russians published a series of videos, and one of the episodes we can see how the Russians destroyed the bridge. The main purpose of that attack was to cut supply and support in the last block of the southern part of northern Vovchansk. So most likely during the next few days, or maybe the Russians have already, will try to establish complete control over this territory, which will, lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian defense belt, at least in the western and the southern part of the northern Vovchansk. Then the Russians will have to just clear the citadel area. There are still very heavy clashes in the citadel area, and for example today the Ukrainians published the video confirming that they still have or still saved control over the territory. For example, in this video we can see the Ukrainian soldiers who were moving along among the almost reduced to ruined buildings, which confirms the Ukrainian presence there. So two more strongholds the Ukrainians, more or less reliable strongholds the Ukrainians have on the direction. This is the first one, the industrial zone, and citadel itself is the second. After the Russians cleared the southern part, then the Russians will focus completely on moving in this direction from basically from the west to the east and from the southwest to the northeast, and after that the northern part of Vovchansk will fall completely. Also, we have some satellite pictures showing us the fire anomalies in the northern part. As you can see, almost every single block, almost every single street in the area was covered with fire, very heavy clashes, and the main activity and the main concentration of fire exactly in the western part of the northern Vovchansk, the area where the Russians have significant progress and where the Russians are advancing. So this is the situation. I think that 1-2 weeks left before complete collapse of the northern Vovchansk, unless the Ukrainians begin the counteroffensive operations. Now we're moving to the north in Kupiansk direction. We have updates from this territory as well. The Russians continue offensive, and now the Russians are trying to improve their positions along the railways from Kislivka further to the west in direction of the next railway station, Shaparovka. Currently, there are very heavy clashes exactly for this territory. The main Russian goal is to establish complete control over this territory, and if the Russians are able to do this, then they will be able to start storming the Ukrainian positions in Stepovo-Novosilovka itself. But before the beginning of storming of Stepovo-Novosilovka, most likely during the next few days, we are going to see some intensifying of actions from the Russian side in the northeastern and the north, let's say, part of Stepovo-Novosilovka. The Russians, first of all, need to semi-encircle or half-encircle the village, and after that, only after that, they would be able, or they're able to do this right now, but only after this semi-encirclement, they will have less chances to be defeated or to suffer significant losses. Furthermore, the Russians have already started the hunting and attacking the Ukrainian positions with FPV drones to the west of Stepovo-Novosilovka, those positions among the fields that Ukrainians are using as the bases, as the communication centers, as rotation places, and many other military purposes. So we see some certain focus. So the battle for Stepovo-Novosilovka, 2 weeks, and the village will be captured most likely. Now let's move further to the south. As we discussed in the previous updates, the Russians can finish this semi-encirclement of the village by the name of Stelmakhovka. Everything is ready to begin the, let's say, final storm attempts of the small stronghold. The Ukrainians, of course, will try to fight for this area as long as possible, but most likely the Ukrainians will not be able to hold this territory for a very long time. I'll remind you that the 77th Air Mobile Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine is responsible for this direction, but this village is already semi-encircled, so most likely after a few waves of attacks, after a few successful waves of attacks, the Ukrainians most likely will be forced to fall back from Stelmakhovka further to the west in direction of Lazova. So a few more days and more updates are going to we are going to receive from this direction. Now let's move to the south in direction of Siversk. We have the most important updates coming from Bilohorivka. Today we got the final confirmation that the Russians managed to establish complete control over the village. I'll remind you that 2 weeks ago the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the village was captured as a result of very heavy clashes, and based on that report we have adjusted the map. Most of the mappers decided not to do anything. They were waiting for some geolocations or more reliable confirmations, and today the Ukrainian sources, as you can see, published the video of how the Ukrainians were hunting and attacking the Russian flags established all over the entire territory of Bilohorivka. Furthermore, we have another important, let's say, report, another important statement from the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation. Today the Russians, for the first time probably for the previous year and a half, reported that the Russians managed to the Ukrainians conducted few counteroffensive operations in the area of responsibility of Group of Forces South, and the Russians stated that they managed to repel few attacks in the vicinity of the village by the name of Grigorovka. So this is the village by the name of Grigorovka, and today this report also confirms that the Russians have bypassed Bilohorivka, that Bilohorivka is already behind the Russian shoulders, that currently the clashes, let's say, are taking place somewhere between Bilohorivka and Grigorovka, somewhere along this line. Most likely, most of the territory is already in the gray zone, but we need a little bit more, let's say, days to do this. But now the battle, officially the battle for Grigorovka has begun. Now let's move further to the south. We have very interesting reports and updates from Chasiv Yar. We have adjusted the map based on the geolocations we received. As you can see, we have corrected the area between Kalinovka and this forest and Bogdanovka, and we colored this territory under complete Russian color. we have 2 geolocations from this area. More precisely, we have 3 geolocations, but 2 videos from the area. The videos were published by the 56th Motorized Brigade, which is responsible for defense of this area. And the first video show us that Ukrainian FPV operators were flying above the trenches and FPV droning the Russian forces inside of these trenches, which confirms that the territory was captured by the Russians before. So this is the first evidence confirming the Russian control over this area. So the Ukrainian FPV drone was bombing the Russians exactly in this point. The next video that was published also by the 56th Brigade show us the movements of the Russian infantry through the fields and how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russian soldiers who were moving, let's say, from the southeast to the northwest. And based on these 2 videos on 3 geolocations, we have adjusted the map. So the situation is very interesting. As you can see, there were reports in the past that the Russians managed to break through the Ukraine defense belt, and that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over this part of Kalinovka and to reach Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal using this route of attack. But after that report, we still haven't received any single geolocated confirmation confirming this progress. And now we see that the Russians probably decided to move in direction of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal a different way. First of all, the Russians decided to clear the forest, this forest that located to the northwest of Bogdanovka, because this is the main stronghold of the armored forces of Ukraine, the area of responsibility of 93rd Mechanized Brigade and the forces of 56th Motorized Brigade. And without clearing this forest, the Russians have very big chances to suffer significant losses during the further progress to the west. So first they need to shorten the line of combat contact. And based on this geolocation, we see that the Russians were moving something like this from Bogdanovka, from farms. The Russians captured these 3 lines, these fortifications, and then bypassed the fields, and most likely currently the Russians are trying to establish complete control over this defense belt. And if the Russians are able to do this, if the Russians are able to dig in deeper in this area, then this forest will be encircled by the Russian forces from the east, from the south, from the southwest, from the west, from the north, and this is going to be like operational encirclement. And this situation sooner or later will force the Ukrainians to fall back towards Grigorovka using this road. Furthermore, we expect, due to this situation, due to this configuration of the front line, we expect the activization of Russian forces in direction of Grigorovka using these roads of attacks. So first the Russians will clear the forest and they will maintain the line of combat contact, trying to create something like this. As soon as the Russians are able to do this, then they will move further to the west in direction of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal, but probably trying to bypass Kalinovka from the north, and by attacking the Ukrainian armed forces, let's say, using these roads of attack. So they're going to do like this. So the main important thing for the Russians, not to capture Kalinovka, but to get to Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. And it doesn't matter how exactly the Russians are planning to do this. If they're able to do this, let's say, to get this area, then they will have access to the Ukrainian positions in the northern Chasiv Yar, and then there might be a completely different story begins, without any storming attempts and clashes inside of Kalinovka as well as in Chasiv Yar. I'll remind you that we have a lot of reports about the Russian foothold on this side of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. Maybe the Russians are going to attack this area as well. So something interesting is going to happen on this direction very soon, and this progress, this advance of armored Russian forces change the picture completely. When talking about eastern Chasiv Yar itself, there are very heavy clashes, but yet the Russians haven't managed to establish complete control over the stronghold. The Ukrainians always counterattack, the Russians always send additional fresh forces, so the battles are taking place for the same high-rise buildings, for the same 2, 3, 4 buildings, and they change their owner, they turn side every single, let's say, day, maybe even for a few times a day. Now let's move to Klishchiivka. After the Russians captured Klishchiivka and reached the western outskirts, the Ukrainians fall back further to the west, but yet the Ukrainians haven't crossed Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. They still have positions on the Russian side, let's call it like this. It's already Russian side of Seversky Donetsk-Donbass canal. There are a few fortifications in the strongholds that Ukrainians understand they can hold for a while. There is like this one, northern fortification area. There is a southern fortification area. So there are still a lot of positions that Ukrainians can fight fight for and to win additional 2-3 weeks before the Russians cross canal completely and start offensive in direction of Stupachki or even further to the west in direction of Konstantinovka. Now let's move to Avdiivka direction. We have a lot of very interesting updates, and the most important that the Russians, after a very short or long operational pause, probably up to 2 weeks, there were no activity from the Russian side. The Russians began offensive with the new fresh forces, with a new power, and as a result of probably first day of clashes, they managed to improve their positions all over the line of combat contact, starting from Kalinovka to the south in direction of Nitailova. The Russians managed to capture, first of all, this small tree line and to get as close as possible to the next defense belt of the armed forces of Ukraine on direction to Kalinova. There is a small stronghold, this one, and there is a very big stronghold further to the, let's say, northeast. So the Russians are planning probably to attack this way, trying to cut, first of all, the fields to the south to maintain the line of combat contact and to begin the storm of Kalinova itself. Furthermore, the Russians managed to improve their positions further to the west in direction of Novoalexandrovka. Few more square meters or square kilometers were captured by the Russians, and now the Russians are trying to semi-encircle at least the eastern part of the village. The Russians improved their positions along the railway from Ocheretyne to the west in direction of Progress. We made this conclusion based on the Ukrainian video of FPV drone strike on Russian forces that was, let's say, sitting between the trenches. So the Russians, as you can see based on this video, are trying to block the Ukrainian positions in the stronghold, this one. The Russians are trying to get here, and if they are able to get here, basically they will close the Ukrainian forces inside of this stronghold, which is, let's say, very important stronghold in the question of defense of Sokol. The Russians managed to improve their positions further along the tree lines to Sokol from, let's say, Ocheretyne to the southwest. The Russians managed to improve their positions from Solovyovo to the west. So we are not talking about thousands of square kilometers captured by the Russians, but as a result of attack, let's say on every single direction, the Russians managed to capture from 50 till 200 meters. Solovyovo Sokol 200 meters, Ocheretyne Solovyovo 50 meters, Ocheretyne Progress 50 meters, Ocheretyne Novoalexandrovka 100 meters. So very small gains, but they are very important because now the Ukrainians need to stretch their forces they need to keep additional resources and reserves in every single town because the Russians are attacking every single point on this direction. Now let's move further to the south. We have important updates from Nitailova. Today the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation confirmed complete control over the territory. The mappers, pro-Ukraine mappers, have already updated their maps showing additional control of the Russian forces. We have adjusted the map as well. The farms, Nitailova itself, the residential area and farms itself are under complete Russian control. So currently the Russians control most likely every single field, every single tree line between the water, let's say, barriers in this area. So there is like lakes, water reservoirs, and some rivers, and now the Russians have almost complete declaring of the territory. Of course, after such a progress, the Russians will move further to the west with the purpose to get the Karlovka water reservoir and capture this residential part that located also on the Russian side of the water barriers. We have some updates from the, let's say, line Yasnobrodovka-Nitailova. The Russian drones are flying. The Ukrainians continue sending some forces in this area, but the Ukrainian reinforcements and reserves are always destroyed by the Russians as a result of artillery fire and FPV drone strikes. So Yasnobrodovka also is going to be the target number one for the Russians during the next few days. Krasnogorovka, we haven't received nothing important from the area. The only thing we got is that the Russians still haven't managed to bypass also Krasnogorovka citadel. Since the beginning of the special military operation, the Russians still haven't found a solution how to bypass and how to crack citadels, because Ugledar, Vovchansk, Bakhmut, Chasiv Yar, and many other different towns, there are always one problem: how to bypass, how to capture high-rise building area. So there was just one successful case in the story of the special military operation, how the Russians managed to bypass this area very fast, and we are talking about the citadel in Bakhmut, the citadel that was stormed by Wagner forces, but Wagner's decided not to waste time, and they were just ruining those buildings one by one with mines, with explosives, and many other things that can destroy the building till ruins. And now the Russians are trying to do probably the same, but for now they can't get very close to the buildings because very tough Ukrainian defense. Now let's move further to the south. Novomikhailivka, Konstantinovka, no updates during the day, just reports about heavy clashes in Paraskovivka, but most likely the Russians are finishing the clearing of the area and most likely the Ukrainians have already abandoned the territory. We got reports that the Russians managed to improve their positions further to the west on the line Salotka-Vadiana. Few more fields and trenches were captured as a result of offensive, and currently the distance between edge Russian positions and the main supply road is less than 4 kilometers, so a few more 100 meters to the west and the Russians will be able to establish complete fire control, at least tank fire control over the main supply road Konstantinovka-Ugledar. Anyway, the situation is getting worse and worse. Staromayorsk, Urozhaine, the Russian military experts start using completely different words about Staromayorsk. Well, a week ago the Russians were saying that the Russians began offensive operation in Staromayorsk, then the Russians were saying that the Russians captured 50, 60, so that the Russians captured some part of Staromayorsk, and starting of today the Russian military experts are using the next sentences. The Russians are about to finish the clearing operation. So most likely Staromayorsk will fall during this week if Ukrainians are not going to counterattack. And of course, after the fall of Staromayorsk, the Urozhaine will fall automatically, at least the southern part and the central part. Some mappers have already adjusted the map in the southern part, showing this territory under complete Russian control, but for now without any geolocations. On the other hand, we see that the Russians continue pummeling and bombing the area with significant number of artillery strikes, aviation strikes, FABs, so the Russians are not counting their munition. They're reducing the Ukrainian positions to ruins. The Russians are not going to risk, they're not going to fight for every single building. They're going just to reduce everything to ruins and then to move further to the north without any resistance and any barriers from the Ukrainian side. For now, there is still a lot of job to do because Urozhaine is a very big village with significant number of buildings, basements, and probably fortifications that Ukrainians have managed to create since the beginning of the creation of the front line. So there are still anyway lots of things, and even if Staromayorsk falls and central part falls, anyway there are still Ukrainians will have possibilities to hold the Russians, at least in the northern part. So for this area they're going to be the heaviest clashes from the Russian side. There are, let's say, rich network of the fortifications, so there are still a lot of job to do. Rabotina, no changes during the previous 24 hours, just regular activity among the fields. So the Russians are bombing the Ukrainians, and when talking about this situation, about this configuration of line of combat contact, everything depends on the Ukrainian side. If they have resources, if they have enough of manpower that can be sent to the fields, because it's always one-way ticket, then Ukrainians will be able to hold the territory. But as soon as they understand that they are no longer available to send forces there, or the units refuse to follow the orders, then Ukrainians will be forced to fall back further to the north in direction of Novodanilovka. Now let's move to Zaporozhye. Another video of Russian FPV drone strikes on Ukrainian positions to the north of Zhiribyanki, and this is very important because if we increase the numbers of updates, we see that the Russians are very focused on this area, especially on this defense belt. Significant number of strikes, significant number of geolocations, which confirms that most likely during the next, if nothing changes, most likely Zhiribyanki, Petykhatki, Lapkova, Kupiansk are going to be the next targets of the Russian armed forces, at least maybe in June, maybe in the beginning of July. So the Russians will try to restore control over every single village and settlement they lost control over during the Ukrainian greatest counteroffensive of 2023. We got very important updates from, let's say, Kiev itself. Today we got report that France will send instructors to Ukraine to train Ukrainian military personnel. Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Sirsky. So this is the first official statement confirmation that the first Western troopers are not just expressed they're willing to enter Ukraine, but there is an agreement and real negotiations and probably real papers been signed that the first France troopers will arrive on the territory of Ukraine. I remind you that a few days ago the Baltic states were talking about the same. So as we can see, another step of escalation, another wave of escalation. Furthermore, we got reports that Zelensky, let's say, visit today Spain because Spain announced about another military package. So Zelensky visited and he has the, let's say, the meeting with the Prime Minister of Spain, and Spain announced about a significant, very big package. They're going to be $1.1 billion, lots of Leopard tanks, lots of very important things that Ukraine requires in this phase of the special military operation, including Patriot missiles. So maybe for months, for maybe a little bit more, the Ukrainians will have a fresh air to get some to regrouping for restoring their health, their power, but anyway, in a month everything will be finished again, and they're gonna need to find additional help from someone else. We'll see who is able to give Ukraine additional help. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.